Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This episode, I'm back talking about Beacon, New York some more. I did 2 episodes about Beacon already. If you haven't listened to those, you can check them out. One was about Mount Beacon, and the other was about Bannerman Castle, which is a creepy castle in the area. And in my look at the castle, I also dug up some of the myths and legends about the area in general. This time, I want to talk about some of the cemeteries that I visited, as well as some of the other creepy stuff or unpleasant stuff that's in Beacon. I know I've said this before, but anytime I'm looking at hauntings, I also always like to look at what skeletons might be in the closet of an area, or what bad things might have happened there, etc., since a lot of people believe that that has some effect potentially on hauntings. So before I get into the cemeteries, I did a few newspaper searches looking for ghost stories about Beacon, stories about hauntings in Beacon, etc., and I just didn't find that much. It feels like there aren't a ton of hauntings that are tied specifically to the town of Beacon, though there's a lot of different stories of hauntings and, like I said last time, legends and ghosts kind of in the area. I did find one story, not on a newspaper search, but on ghostsofamerica.com, which is a website where people can submit their stories about hauntings. There are multiple stories about graveyards in Beacon that are supposedly haunted. So obviously this website is not the most reputable source, and these accounts don't say which graveyard these experiences happened in, but I did want to share these since I am going to talk about some of the cemeteries in Beacon. So the first one, the graveyards were very haunted, and when you went in them, you immediately felt spirits watching and following you, and it was confirmed by the sounds in the woods walking with you as you were walking, and you couldn't get out of them fast enough. Beacon, New York is a place of many hauntings in many places. So, no specific details here, really, and it's very easy to just hear the rustling of leaves in the wood or animals in the woods and think, oh, there's a ghost or a spirit, etc. Again, not the most reputable source, but I felt it was worth mentioning. And I'm with this person, it does feel creepy. I don't know that I would immediately say that something is a ghost, but I also wouldn't immediately say that it's not. So to read from the other longer mention of graveyards in Beacon. Okay, my friends and I go walking throughout a graveyard every once in a while. We help take care of things and just goof off. So one time, one of my friends was walking through and she noticed the grave of a little girl. It was dusk and getting dark, so she was going to go home. On her way out, she heard giggling and walking behind her. She turned around and followed it, and I led her back to the little girl's grave. The other day it was her, my boyfriend, 2 other guys, and I. We were walking and being nonchalant, and I noticed a little girl. I could only see from the middle of the bridge of her nose to the middle of her shins. She laughed. I'd seen her before, but this time I wigged. I ran out so fast that I almost passed out. My friend's house is on the corner a few blocks away, so I just hightailed it there. My boyfriend, his friends, and my girlfriend were all puzzled. Whilst running away, I heard the little girl laughing. So this one feels also like something I'm a little skeptical of, right? So it has kind of that horror movie trope of like, oh, it's a creepy little girl pursuing you. She's laughing, etc. But it has more details, and it claims that other people saw this apparition as well, and it says that it happened more than once. So those are some things on the scale for seems not completely not credible. And then all the stuff I said already are the reasons why it seems not credible. The way it's written too, it's just a little hard to take seriously. But again, felt like it was worth reading. These are the only mentions I was able to find of hauntings in Beacon itself, which is just really, really weird, right? Like it's a place that nowadays attracts a lot of artists and creatives, people who probably write stories, etc. So there's that. Secondly, it's just creepy, right? Like it's this former industrial area that fell on hard times and it's now being gentrified, but it has these ruins everywhere. It has the woods There's animals everywhere. I saw a ton of deer while I was there. There's this feeling of things creeping around there. So I really felt like there should have been more ghost stories, but I don't know. For whatever reason, there weren't. But now that we're through the cemetery ghost stories I wanted to talk about, I want to tell you about some of the cemeteries I visited. So I was in Beacon for 2.5 days, and I visited 3 cemeteries, I believe. And the one that I was most excited about was the abandoned Dutch Reformed Church Cemetery. I learned about this cemetery from Atlas Obscura. They have a really great article about it. But first off, if you visit this cemetery, you are trespassing. I don't want to encourage anyone to trespass. The whole place is covered in no trespassing signs and stuff. And I'm not totally convinced that the cemetery is completely safe. I was very careful when I was walking. And just in general, as someone who goes on a lot of weird adventures alone, at all times I have an easy way to broadcast my location via GPS to my emergency contact. So if I ever do get in trouble, I know I'm covered. I try to be very careful. But again, I am not encouraging anyone to trespass. I'm not convinced that it's safe. There was a place where it looked like a grave had maybe partially collapsed or something. There was this hole that just looked like it went, way down into darkness. There are vaults there that are falling apart and caving in. There's tombstones that are toppling. And also, I feel like you might get caught if you visit. So in addition to the safety concerns that I have with this cemetery, it is off a busy road near the train station, and it's in between 2 different police departments. So the train cops are about a block away near the station, and then the regular cops have a huge station about a block in the other direction. So the police presence is pretty intense in the area. Also, 3 sides of the cemetery are very wooded and you can't see much through the trees and grass, at least in the summer. But one side of the cemetery is pretty open, and on the other side of that open area is a really fancy apartment complex that I'm very sure has surveillance cameras. So I don't know how much people care about folks trespassing in the cemetery, but I do know that if someone wanted to prove that you had trespassed and gone into the cemetery, it would be pretty easy. And, while I was there, I didn't geotag any of my Instagram stories about this cemetery or anything, just to be safe while I was in the area. Also, since as you've probably guessed, I'm an extremely cautious person, I woke up really early and left our Airbnb before dawn, so that way not too many people would be around. It was still dark. And in fact, aside from running into 2 deer that scared me half to death, don't worry, I scared them too. The only other individual that I ran into on my way to the cemetery was a scowling, middle-aged man wearing a NYPD baseball cap who looked at me very suspiciously. So again, there is a big police presence in town, and it's a small town, so people know if you're like a hiker or tourist from out of town when they look at you. So again, don't trespass. That being said, I'll tell you all about the cemetery now. So the cemetery is located at the bottom of a hill. It's behind the oldest church in Beacon, which used to be called the Dutch Reformed Church. It has a new name now, new congregation, but it's this beautiful Victorian Gothic church that was built in 1859. The original Dutch Reformed Church was built in 1813 there, back when the town was known as Fishkill Landing, but that was demolished and replaced with the 1859 structure. So anyway, very early in the morning in the dark, I went to this church and I walked around to the back to get to the cemetery. And the first thing that I saw was a folding chair set up behind the church, facing the woods and the cemetery behind it. No one was there in the chair, but something about that was really chilling, just to see this chair sitting there in the dark behind this church, and there wasn't a lot of space between the church and where the hill goes into this, there's like this steep hill down. There's maybe 15 feet. So just in that little narrow area behind the church where there's nothing else, there's just this chair. And I had this feeling, as if as soon as I went down into the cemetery, someone would go into that chair and sit there and watch me. And I assume that didn't happen, but you can't actually see the chair from inside the cemetery. So, The cemetery on that side has yellow crime scene type tape that says, I don't know, I think it says like no trespassing or something like that, all around it on that side. But there is a clear gap in the trees for what looks like sort of a path where people might go down that steep hill. Now, I didn't have my headlamp with me because somehow my headlamp vanished on me right before the trip, and I've had to order a new one since. I still have no idea where my headlamp is. And the only flashlight I had was my mini Maglite flashlight. So there's no way I was going to be walking down a steep decline into the woods in the dark without being able to see where I was walking, where I knew there were going to be broken tombstones and other hazards, especially because I was just wearing running shoes. Since this trip, I've ordered hiking boots that work in warm weather. I learned my lesson. So next time I'll be better outfitted in that way anyway. So I was not going to walk down that weird little path. So I figured I'd walk around the block, look at the cemetery from the other side where the major road was. By the time I'd walked around, the sun had risen. But luckily there still weren't any cars on the road. And I found a place that looked a little easier to scramble up from the sidewalk, and I ended up in the cemetery. Then when I got into the cemetery, I saw that there was a really easy way in and out near that apartment complex that I mentioned. So that's how I ended up getting into the cemetery. The whole time I was in the cemetery, I had this really strong feeling of being watched. At the time, I thought it was just a combination of that chair that I saw facing the cemetery, which I couldn't see, the apartment complex where I knew people could see me from their windows if they looked out of them, and just the knowledge that I was trespassing and that I knew there were tons and tons of cops in this town. And maybe that's all it was, but the whole time I was in the cemetery, I felt extremely uncomfortable. I didn't attempt any paranormal investigation type stuff. I mostly just walked around, I took some pictures and some video, and then I honestly left as soon as I could. Also, it was late summer, so it was extremely hot and humid. It was very buggy in there, and that's when I realized I'd forgotten to bring bug spray, so the whole time I was fighting off mosquitoes and flies that were just swarming me. Even though my only exposed skin was my lower arms, hands, neck, and face, they were still everywhere. It was very gross. And it just felt bad being there. So anyway, the Atlas Obscura article mentioned that there were human remains visible around the collapsed family vaults on the side of the hill. I didn't see any human remains there. I will say, though, the Atlas Obscura pictures looked like they had been taken on a bright winter afternoon some time ago, and it was an overcast summer day right at dawn when I was there, so the vaults, which are these arched brick structures built into the side of the hill, these vaults looked totally dark. Even when I shined my flashlight into them, which of course was not that powerful, I didn't see any bones, but I also didn't go inside because of 1, the dark, 2, I really don't think it's safe at all to go into them because they were literally in the process of collapsing. Like the arched entryways were collapsing. They were made out of brick and you could just see them kind of collapsing in on themselves. I didn't know if there would be some critters in there that I didn't want to encounter. Just anyway, it was very creepy and very obviously dangerous. So I was not going in there to see if there were human remains. But I actually think that some of the human remains that I saw in pictures online have been removed since. I read later on elsewhere that the remains from the vaults were relocated, including the remains of a Colonel William Few, who signed the U.S. Constitution on behalf of the state of Georgia. It sounds like some of his remains have been reinterred in Georgia, or all of his remains have been reinterred in Georgia, but there's still a historical marker in front of the church in Beacon announcing that he was buried there. Few's remains were moved back in the 70s, but I get the sense that the other reinterments happened maybe in the last decade or so, though I could be wrong. So the burials in the cemetery range from 1813 to the early 20th century. I think the last burials there were around the 1920s. This was the place where the important people in town were buried, right? And it definitely is a bit of a memento mori, even more so than most cemeteries are. Because most cemeteries, you go there and you're like, okay, I'm reminded of death. But this cemetery, you go there and you're reminded not just of death, but of the idea of being forgotten in death, right? Because these were the, quote, important people in town. And even they are kind of forgotten at this point. Their tombs and their graves are in terrible disrepair, collapsing in on themselves. People aren't even supposed to visit the cemetery, so people can't even pay their respects to your grave. And maybe part of why it made me feel so uncomfortable was because to me, the message of that cemetery was, yeah, you're going to die and you're going to be forgotten. And even the stones that are placed there to memorialize you will collapse and fall over and be worn down and be forgotten. And no one will even be allowed to visit your grave. Like, it had this very negative feeling, and that could be part of it, right? It really is a pity that this historic cemetery is in such disrepair. And I'm sure that really colored my experience there. Whether or not I was experiencing anything paranormal, there was this huge discomfort I felt. And I guess that's the right way to feel when you go to a cemetery like that, but it's sad. So, all around the cemetery, there were tons of fallen tombstones and monuments. There was also a stone wall on the far side of the cemetery, which led to a part of the cemetery that wasn't in the woods. It was in, I guess you would call it a clearing, but because the cemetery is abandoned and it was late summer in New York, there was tall grass and other underbrush type stuff that was basically taller than I was, covering that whole area. So you could sort of see some monuments there, but they were very much obscured. And there was no way I was venturing into the tall grass where I couldn't see anything. Not just because I couldn't see the tombstones, but also because, bugs, particularly ticks, were a large concern for me. And also just felt unsafe and creepy to venture. I know I was in like a wooded area that no one could see into, but there was something different about venturing into like this underbrush or whatever that's taller than me, like these tall, weird plants. Just felt like a bad idea. But looking over that part of the cemetery, like, looking in that direction, you can see a view of the Hudson River right beyond it, which was really beautiful. I would have said that it was peaceful, but like I mentioned, I was on edge and uncomfortable there the entire time. But the view really was beautiful because it is, like I said, close to the train station. The train station's right on the water, so, nice view. So once I felt like I'd seen everything I could safely, I left. Later that night, though, I made my wife watch the GoPro footage I took of the cemetery. I think I've mentioned this before, but she's very sensitive, like a lot more sensitive to paranormal things than I am. And the whole time she was watching the footage, she was just like, turn it off. I don't want to watch this. There's something off about that place. And I was like, because I'm a jerk, oh, it's just a few minutes more. I just want to show you where I went and hear what you think. Because, she, like a reasonable person, was still asleep when I went. And near the end, there's a bit where I filmed part of the cemetery that's closest to sort of a thick stand of trees that are near the road. And she was watching the video. She was like, who's that? And I was like, what do you mean, who's that? I was alone. It was early on a weekend morning. There was definitely no one else there. I would have known. It's not that big of a cemetery. And I was very on alert. And she was like, oh no, I saw someone in the video. Now, she didn't want to watch the footage again, and I don't blame her. I've watched it a handful of times now. I don't see anybody. I don't see a figure. There's a possibility that she saw movement from the wind blowing in the trees or a car passing beyond the trees. We were watching it on the small screen of my GoPro, after all. But even though I don't see anything in the video, I still think it's notable and worth mentioning and worth me thinking about, just because my wife is more sensitive than I am. And even if there's not anything there that I can see in the footage, she may have been sensing something, I don't know, like non-visual or something. Like maybe she was picking something up that I was not aware of. I don't totally know how this stuff works, but I do think that two people can look at something and see two different things. I don't know that it means that one of them is wrong, especially when you're talking about paranormal stuff. So I probably should try to post the video somewhere, like on YouTube or something. Maybe I'll try to clean it up and do that. And again, I don't know that the point is like, let's try to find this figure in the video, but I just felt like it was notable that she was like very confidently, she's like, who's that? Like standing there. I was like, there's not anybody there. It was just me. So that was the cemetery I was most excited to visit. It was definitely the creepiest one I visited. And again, don't trespass, stay safe, etc. So then that same morning, I went to the Methodist Cemetery, and I think next to it there was also a cemetery, maybe called the Afro-American Union Burial Ground. It's weird because that cemetery is just like basically in a city block in the middle of a suburban, like neighborhood. And it's not really labeled, I don't think. If it was labeled, it wasn't super prominent. There wasn't a gate around the cemetery. It was literally just on a lot. And this Methodist cemetery wasn't too far away from the Dutch Reformed Church cemetery. Find a Grave said that it was well maintained, though I would debate that because a lot of the tombstones were basically just stacked on top of each other in piles, leaned up against trees. There were tons leaned up against trees. It was a free-for-all, really, when it came to where those monuments and stones and stuff were. There was another hole that I thought might have been part of a grave having collapsed. I don't know. But I mentioned there was also the Afro-American Union Burial Ground, and there was a plaque up at the cemetery. There's like basically a big empty part of the plot or the lot, I guess. So there's, all these stones and there's this big empty part, right next to someone's house. And the person who lived in that house was watching me very suspiciously the whole time. I can't imagine why. At any rate, there's like a historical marker by the empty looking area where there's, not really any stones. And there's a phone number and you call the phone number and there's this really interesting historical note, I guess, from a Black man who grew up in the area and lived there all his life since I think the 1920s. So had seen all these different sides of Beacon and kind of seen it changed over the years, etc. And he was doing a lot of research about Black people in Beacon throughout history. And he learned that, this part of this cemetery was where Black people in the area were buried. I found on a website called Beacon Cemetery Trail, I found a little bit more info about the history of that part of the cemetery. So I wanted to read from Beacon Cemetery Trail. In 1851, James F. Brown, along with Samuel Sampson, Edward Bush, Christian Reynolds, and Samuel Gomer, purchased from John DeWint a portion of the land adjacent to the Methodist Cemetery to create a cemetery for the Black community. The first burial was of J. Henry Roos on October 31st, 1851. There are a few surviving stones for Warren Gomer, who may have been related to Samuel Gomer, and for two Civil War soldiers. One is for Jones, and the other one, which is not legible, may be for Henry Sales. The stone for Civil War veteran Spencer DeFreeze, who was buried on July 18th, 1875, must have fallen and moved at some point. It is now in the Methodist section. So like I said, these stones were all mixed up together. It's really sad that the Afro-American Union Burial Ground has been sort of lost to history a little bit, or that at least, there aren't that many monuments for the people buried there, that many tombstones, and the ones that are there are kind of all mixed up with the others. And I know I've talked about this a lot, but there's a reason why it's hard to find out a lot of good information about Black people in America prior to, I was going to try to think of a date, just historical information in general, information from the 19th century and before in particular. I've talked about trying to find more information about Black people who lived in the part of Astoria that I live in, and it's difficult. And of course, right? Because when people were enslaved, there's very little record, but even after emancipation and after the Civil War, between, racism and economic factors, etc., if you can't afford a tombstone or if you're not getting a tombstone for one reason or another, like that's another way you can be like lost to history. Someone would have to find the record elsewhere. You can't just like walk down the street and be like, oh, there's a cemetery, and like find these tombstones and like research and do this history uncovering, right? So I don't know that I have a strong point here aside from the fact that it sucks. And as I've talked about in some of my New York City cemetery episodes. It just sucks how many cemeteries that were dedicated as, African-American cemeteries back in the day, how many of those are gone and lost and forgotten. Okay, so that's that cemetery. The third cemetery that I visited was the St. Luke Episcopal Cemetery, which is near the hiking path for Mount Beacon. So I passed it going to Mount Beacon and also coming from Mount Beacon. And I don't have a lot to say about the cemetery. I actually was almost more charmed by the church that was by the cemetery because it was just like a really beautiful looking church. It looked like, I got this feeling like, oh, it feels like it's been transported from the English countryside or something. I don't know. It was just very picturesque. So that was another cemetery that I visited. It's also kind of basically in the shadow of Mount Beacon. So it's a dramatic location for a cemetery. So other strange stuff in Beacon. So I may have mentioned this in the other episodes, but I visited a lot of ruins. Those included the ruins of the old Beacon Hat Mill and the Dennings Point ruins. So the Dennings Point ruins were an old brick factory. And, both of these were reminders of Beacon's industrial past. I saw bricks stamped with, the abbreviation for that brick factory, both at our Airbnb, like in the garden. They had framed part of the garden with bricks from this factory that were obviously from this factory because they were stamped. And then also at the ruins of the Mount Beacon Incline Railway, which I talked about in the Mount Beacon episode, you could see, there were just bricks everywhere from the ruined building, and those bricks were also from that brick factory at Dennings Point. And I think I mentioned this in the Mount Beacon episode, but, part of the reason why this brick factory and brick factories in general in that area were on the water was because you could just, make your bricks, put them on a boat, and then sail that boat down to Manhattan. And there was always construction that needed to be done in New York City. So those bricks are probably in many New York City buildings as well, or at least were at one point. Who knows how many of those are still around. So in addition to ruins, there's also some institutions, let's call them, with some dark histories in the area of Beacon. So the first one I want to talk about is Craig House. This is no longer open, and I believe, according to Atlas Obscura, the home that this was based in is still around, but it is privately owned. Atlas Obscura had a warning about a strong police presence, and it's not open to the public or anything. But in 1859, a mansion was built on 60 acres of land in Beacon. Though the building was originally home for a Civil War officer, it was purchased by a Scottish doctor named Clarence Slocum. He renamed the mansion Craig House and turned it into basically a private sanatorium for the very wealthy. So, to read a little bit of the Atlas Obscura article about it, Slocum, quote, believed that his patients could be cured by intensive talk therapy, coupled with fine dining and recreational pursuits like golf, skiing, and painting. For decades, it was America's most prestigious rehabilitation home, the perfect haven for patients to be cured. So a lot of really tragic stuff happened at Craig House, as you could probably imagine, since mentally ill people were being treated there. So last year I did a couple episodes about Asheville, North Carolina, and one thing I talked about was how F. Scott Fitzgerald moved his wife Zelda to a sanatorium in Asheville because the hospital, or the sanatorium she was at in New York, was too expensive. Craig House is where she was in New York. And at that time, in 1934, Craig House cost $750 a month, which in today's dollars is $15,311. So needless to say, it was extremely expensive. And as I talked about in the Asheville episodes, F. Scott Fitzgerald wasn't exactly at his peak in terms of affluence, etc. in the 1930s. And I go into a lot more detail about the ends of both Scott and Zelda's lives in the Asheville episode. So if you want to know more about that and their tragic story and lives, you can check that out. But she was in Beacon for a time. Another dark thing about Craig House is that Rosemary Kennedy was sent there after her lobotomy, which is a completely horrific story in and of itself that I won't go into here. But needless to say, if there's a Kennedy curse, it's my belief that it came about because of what they did to Rosemary and they deserved it. So, screw the Kennedys, I guess. Justice for Rosemary? I don't know. She died a long time ago. But she was also in Craig House, and what was done to her was really, really, really bad. So, more bad vibes in Beacon, right? So, next, trigger warning for suicide. I'm not going to go into any details here, but I'll discuss a suicide here. So, I found articles from April 15th, 1950, about Frances Seymour Brokaw Fonda, who was Henry Fonda's estranged wife and Jane Fonda's mother, and she killed herself at the Craig Sanatorium in Beacon. She was apparently depressed because Henry Fonda was marrying a 21-year-old woman, and Frances Fonda was only 42 years old when she died. One article that I found mentioned that Henry Fonda was starring in a play at the time, and he showed up to work to perform at the play 12 hours after his wife's death. The show must go on, I guess, especially when you're engaged to a much younger woman, and maybe it was convenient that your wife died. I don't know. I didn't do a huge amount of research about the Fondas because it was dark and was making me sad, but again, another dark thing that happened at Beacon, famously dark, and who knows how many bad things might have happened at the Craig Sanatorium, how many people might have died or had a bad time for one reason or another there. You know, even if it's a really nice sanatorium, you're still being confined and you're still dealing with some kind of mental health crisis, so you're not having like a fun time there, I assume. So, like I said, I did not visit Craig House because it's closed to the public and it sounds like the property's plastered with no trespassing signs. But Atlas Obscura said that someone new purchased the house in 2018, and apparently there are lots of cops around there, so probably not the place to try to trespass. But I'll close on this bit about Craig House with another quote from the Atlas Obscura article. Visiting today, it is a silent and haunting place. The inside remains perfectly preserved, as though the good doctor and his glamorous patients had suddenly left the room. As Zelda at her most troubled wrote to her beloved husband, the sense of sadness and finality in leaving a place is a good emotion. I hope that the story can't be changed again and that one more place is haunted. Old sorrows and a half-forgotten happiness are stored where they can be recaptured. So that's Craig House. Let's talk about some prisons next. So I found some articles when I was, searching for information about Beacon from July 1961 about 5 escaped inmates from the Mattawan State Hospital in Beacon. 2 of the inmates were murderers. The cops ended up finding them hiding out in the woods a few miles away from the institution. So, like I said, the woods are very creepy, and at some points there were murderers hanging out in the woods. There was also a case in June 1953 where some inmates escaped, and there were other stories of escapes around that time as well. It sounds like for a time there was an issue with escapes. But basically, the Mattawan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane was opened in 1892. Technically, another institution called the Asylum for Insane Criminals, really not mincing words with that name. The Asylum for Insane Criminals was relocated there, and then they renamed it in 1893. So there was this hospital there. In 1899, another mental hospital for prisoners was opened at the Clinton Correctional Facility, which was called the Dannemora State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Wikipedia describes it as a, quote, massive insane asylum. Apparently people call Dannemora New York's Little Siberia because of how cold it gets and how isolated it is in upstate New York. I looked it up, and Dannemora isn't anywhere near Beacon. It's a 4 to 5 hour drive away, pretty close to Canada. But anyway, Dannemora held male prisoners who went insane while serving their prison sentence, whereas Mattawan State Hospital held male prisoners who weren't convicted yet, and it also held both convicted and unconvicted female prisoners. So, another insane asylum type situation. So, while Mattawan closed in 1977, its cemetery, where 1,000 patients are buried, is apparently located just south of Beacon High School. And some of the buildings of the old Madawan State Hospital are now part of the Fishkill Correctional Facility, which is a prison that is now in Beacon. And that prison holds both minimum and maximum security sections. One thing that felt worth mentioning to me is that in 1998, they built a maximum security S block special housing unit, or SHU, to hold 200 inmates. I usually think of the SHU as meaning solitary confinement because of what I've seen on TV, but I'm not actually sure if they're always 100% solitary or not. Like, I looked it up and it was a little unclear. But solitary confinement is torturous. Like, it's considered torture by the United Nations, and many reputable sources and researchers, etc., have said that it's extremely unethical. So, at any rate, if even some of the SHU at Fishkill Correctional Facility is for solitary, that's real bad. And just in general, and I've talked about this before, a lot of people are in prison who really shouldn't be. Basically almost nobody should be in prison. And, having a prison in an area also adds to whatever you want to call it, negative vibes or whatever. It's not good. It's a place where there's a lot of injustice and pain, etc. Oh, but if you do want to hear more about solitary confinement, etc., you should check out a recent episode of the Lunatics Radio Hour podcast. They did an episode in the last week or two about isolation and basically like what happens to the human psyche when isolated. It's a very upsetting listen, but it's very interesting. So if you want to know more about that, you can check that out. So with that, that's some of the dark side of Beacon that I've been able to dig up, abandoned cemeteries, prisons, abandoned sanatoriums, etc. It makes sense that the vibe in Beacon is so kind of foreboding. I really like it there. It's a cool place, but it has its ghosts. Whether or not they're like paranormal ghosts, it definitely has the ghosts of its past kind of very present there. And, if you're in the area, I definitely recommend that you check Beacon out. It's a really interesting place, really cool hiking, ruins, etc. And that's what I've got for Beacon. So before I end this episode, I did want to talk a little bit about Rikers Island. I've mentioned Rikers Island on the podcast before. Literally since my first episode, I've been talking about it. And if you follow me on social media, you definitely have seen me posting stories and stuff about what's been going on in Rikers. But I wanted to make sure to pause and give a little bit of an update since I do talk about Rikers from time to time on this podcast. Some of this is pretty upsetting. I won't go into a ton of detail, but I'll go into a little bit of detail. But if you don't want to hear that detail, you should still check out the Emergency Release Fund. You can check it out at emergencyreleasefund.com. It's a bail fund dedicated to trying to get high-risk inmates out of Rikers because most of the people in Rikers have not been convicted of any crime. They're just in there because they can't afford to pay bail to get out. So, content warning for suicide. If you don't want to hear about suicide, stop listening. So a couple weeks ago, here in New York, some elected officials visited Rikers Island. This included some state senators and city council members, I believe. It was, a group of local politicians. And conditions in Rikers have been really bad. There are a lot of factors that feed into that, including absenteeism among the guards, like correctional officers. And there's been overcrowding. There had been reports of, people not being given their medication, not being given food, etc. And this group of elected officials visited, and things were really, really bad. And in fact, one inmate tried to kill himself in front of the elected officials. That's how bad things are in Rikers right now. People are being denied food. They're being denied like life-saving medications. So like diabetic people are being denied insulin, etc. Like people who must take their medicine or they will die are not being given their medicine. I wanted to read a little bit from an article that was published in The Intercept with some more information about what's been going on. So to read from that, there's a segregated intake unit that we walked through where they have people held in showers, said Alice Fontier, managing director of Neighborhood Defender Services, who toured one Rikers building, the Otis Bantam Correctional Center, with lawmakers. It's about 2 feet wide by 6 feet. There is no toilet. They've given them plastic bags to use for feces and urine, and they're sitting in the cells with their own bodily waste locked into these conditions. This is the most horrific thing I've seen in my life. I've been coming to this jail since 2008. This is unlike anything that has ever happened there. So, to read a bit more from the article, Rikers has been a festering wound in New York City for about as long as it has existed as a jail complex. Cut off from the rest of the city by water on all sides and accessible only by a long causeway, New York's island gulag has always been out of sight and out of mind. Periodically, a snapshot of the conditions inside will escape the island's event horizon, as in 2014, when the then U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara issued a scathing report describing Rikers as a place more inspired by Lord of the Flies than any legitimate philosophy of humane detention. In the last 8 months, 10 people have died in custody on the island, 5 of them taking their own lives. This article was published on September 16th. Today is September 27th, and that number has gone up to 11 now. 11 people have died this year on Rikers Island. So, to go back to the article, COVID-19 is once again on the rise on Rikers. On September 10th, the chief medical officer on Rikers wrote a letter to New York City Council warning that, quote, in 2021, we have witnessed a collapse in basic jail operations, such that today I do not believe the city is capable of safely managing the custody of those it is charged with incarcerating in its jails. I'll link this article in the show notes if you want to read the whole article in The Intercept. It kind of talks about how this came about and some of the political forces at work behind this. Rikers is set to close in 2026, though many people say that it should close earlier, because obviously it should. And again, remember, 85% of the people detained at Rikers are pre-trial, often there because they just can't afford the bail, and people are dying because they're being put in Rikers and held there because they can't afford bail. And last time I checked, not being able to afford bail for a crime, you haven't been convicted of a crime yet at that point. Not being able to afford bail, basically being poor and being in the wrong place at the wrong time, shouldn't carry a death sentence, right? So bail funds like the Emergency Release Fund have been trying to get out the most high-risk people as they possibly can. There have been movements to do bail reform and stuff, though the kind of political machine here in New York, judges, cops, etc., have done everything they can to try to defy those bail reforms or, make them not as helpful as they should be. So at any rate, I wanted to make sure to mention that. It's completely unbelievable, though also not surprising, knowing the history of Rikers, that all of this is happening. It's really, really awful. And again, emergencyreleasefund.com is where you can go if you want to donate to a bail fund to help get high-risk people out of Rikers. So on that cheery note, that'll be it for this time. You can check out the show notes with all of the sources for this episode at buriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram at buriedsecretspodcast. And thanks so much for listening.